Hi, I'm Bob Orr, and welcome to another edition of Washington Unplugged and our Flashpoints with Juan Zarate, our national security consultant. Juan, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Bob.
Big news again this week regarding Wikileaks. Now they have put forward some of the files that they have relating to the detainees at Guantanamo, and we're seeing some classified information about some of these detainees. Taken as a whole, what does any of this stuff tell us?
Well, the first point is that people who have been debating Guantanamo, the wisdom or the lack thereof of Guantanamo and our detention policies, are going to find fodder in these releases for any of their arguments. It's, the old saying, the devil can use the Bible, quote the Bible for his own purposes. I think anybody involved in the debate on Guantanamo can use these WikiLeaks documents for any purpose.
On either side.
On either side.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point. But for me, what's interesting are three things. One, it reemphasizes the fact that Guantanamo is still open and will be open through the duration of this administration, if not through a second term. You and I have talked a lot about that. And it reminds people, especially looking at sort of the earlier documents, of why Guantanamo was actually open. The fact that we were flooded with these people in theater, and there was a desire to get them out of the war zone in Afghanistan and try to milk them for the intelligence purposes, and frankly just to get them out of the region. And that's in part why Guantanamo was born. If it hadn't been Guantanamo, it would have been somewhere else. And so this wasn't just some sort of fanciful desire to be cruel to people. This was an effect of the war, the invasion of Afghanistan.
It was an answer to a problem.
Right.
You had to put them somewhere.
Right. So it re-emphasizes kind of the birth of Guantanamo, that the fact that it's open, it's still going to be open. Secondly, it underscores the fact that the people who remain there are very dangerous. And I think it underscores the fact that we've gotten rid of a lot of folks who were perhaps less dangerous, perhaps held improperly, or just we made calculated decisions to let them go. But the people who are there are actually dangerous. And so some of the documents that show people promising retribution, death, very violent death to the military guys who are the captors there. I mean, this emphasizes how bad these guys are, and I think that's important. Finally, I think, and this is a really important point, I think, is it emphasizes the difficulty of assessing risk, because part of the reviews of these individuals, that's the documents that were released, is an assessment not only of who they were or what they did with Al-Qaeda or how they were trained, but what kind of risk they present if they were to be released. And whether or not we could feel comfortable releasing them with the security guarantees given by certain governments. Because we've seen that a number of the individuals who've been released, despite the security guarantees we've gotten from other governments, have returned to the battlefield, have killed people, lots of people. And so I think this emphasizes the challenge of assessing risk of future danger in an ongoing conflict, and explains why the Obama administration, even absent the question of the closure of Guantanamo, was going to keep a lot of these individuals in custody wherever for the long term, because they will prove dangerous in the future. And that explains why the Yemenis have not been returned to Yemen. They present too much of a danger from a national security perspective based on the judgment made on risk.
Even in particular cases where they might not be singularly a big threat, they've got no safe place to go where they won't be indoctrinated or...
That's exactly risk. That's exactly right. The risk is not just what risk does this particular individual present, but what environment are they going into? And so with the Yemenis, it's a sense that you have a resurgent Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a government that doesn't have any control of its territory. In fact, it's growing more and more chaotic and volatile. And so less and less ability to say that that is not a risky move to transfer these people to Yemen, even if we want to. Even if we determine that that particular individual isn't all that dangerous in comparison to others.
But the big takeaway, as you said at the outset, is Gitmo is there, it's going to stay there, and it's going to be there a long time, I think.
One other political point. The statement from the government, from Jeff Morrell and Ambassador Dan Fried, two gentlemen I know well. They are individuals who served in the Bush administration and have now served well in the Obama administration. Interestingly, in their statement, they point to the fact that both administrations were trying very hard to release individuals, but also to make that risk calculus. They point to the 537 detainees that the Bush administration released, the 67 detainees the Obama administration released. It's the first time I've seen a statement from the government on Guantanamo, from this administration, that kind of kludges the policies of both administrations. And I think it may be a sign of maturity and a recognition that these issues are hard to deal with and are going to be with us for some time.
In some ways, it might be a default position because the Obama administration wanted to make a big change. They came in, they said they're going to make a big change, and then they found out this was really hard.
It's really hard either because there were already problems inherent in how the structure was set up, or simply because in an ongoing conflict with bad people, it's hard to make determinations as to whether or not they should be released and how they should be released. And in cases where you don't have enough evidence to present in any court, whether criminal or military, you just can't let them go. And that's the determination the Obama administration has made, regardless of whether or not they're going to be housed in Guantanamo or somewhere else.
All right, let's keep it in Cuba, interestingly enough.
Yep.
But let's talk about the Cuban government and what's happening there. There's been talk of reform, but you're telling me maybe not so much.
Yeah, Cuba held a historic party congress a week and a half ago, where there were hopes that the reforms to be announced by Raul Castro and Fidel Castro, who made an appearance, a historic appearance, according to the Cuban press, that would lead to real reforms, that it would lead to openings and some steps that Raul Castro was hinting at when he talked about the failure of the revolution in terms of its economic program, et cetera. And in some ways, and you know, for those who are hopeful in regard to reforms on the island, there were some things announced that were interesting. For example, the fact that Cubans would be allowed for the first time in 50 years to buy and sell homes, to buy and sell cars. The fact that there would be term limits on some Communist Party positions. All that's very...
That was a little hard to swallow.
Hard to swallow. All of it somewhat undercut by the fact that the people who are going to be in charge of the next stages of the Communist Party and the rule on the island are old hands, are old guard sort of revolutionaries who do not want to see capitalism return to the island, and certainly don't have political reform on their agenda. And so I think this was, unfortunately, an empty Congress with the hope of reform falling on the reality of a Cuban government that does not want to cede power, especially with Raul Castro and Fidel Castro still hovering over it.
But we can't be surprised by that. I mean, not to be too cynical, but it would have been, I think, an upset of sorts if it had been different.
I think that's right, and I think the tea leaves have been read over the past few months that the trend lines are not good. I think there was hope when the Obama administration came on, and with the transition to Raul Castro taking over from Fidel Castro in day-to-day governance, that there would be an opening. The Obama administration opened up a potential channel for diplomacy, but that has all been quashed. There hasn't been the type of dialogue, and in fact the Cubans have held and put on trial an American who was down there doing USAID work, and that has created tension with the U.S. government. So the hopes for an opening, hopes for real reform, I think are falling on the realities that you have an old guard regime that is holding on to survival. I think one thing that's interesting is, does this wave of democracy, this fourth wave of democracy that some have talked about, start to impact Cuba and some of the young folks? Because the demographics in Cuba are such that you know, the vast majority of folks now were born after the revolution, and so is there some infection of the youth in Cuba, of the spirit of democracy and opening? And I think this is something the Cuban government is probably thinking about and worried about.
That would make Hugo Chavez in Venezuela nervous also.
Right, which supports the Cuban government, about $3 billion worth of oil aid every year. They've sort of replaced the Soviet Union as a safety valve for the Cuban economy.
You talked about the spring of revolution, so let's go there now. In the Arab world, we've talked about all the trouble spots, but as you point out, there's kind of like this little sea of tranquility there right in the middle with the UAE. Yeah,
the United Arab Emirates has served in some ways as an oasis amongst the tumult of this Arab Spring. And it's very interesting to watch because this is a Gulf monarchy running several emirates, the most famous of which is Dubai. People know this perhaps from the Sex and the City movies or other things. But the reality is this has served as an oasis, a place where people in the region, business folks, including you know, foreign individuals, have retreated to wait out the tumult, to see what happens regionally. It's also been a retreat for capital. You've seen an increase in the investments in places like Dubai, which had been hurting in terms of its credit and other economic problems in recent years. And so what you see is a real kind of sense that you know, UAE continues to be an oasis. They've also sort of asserted themselves geopolitically, being very supportive of the military actions in Libya, along with Qatar. Also supporting Saudi Arabia and Bahrain in terms of the GCC support of the crackdown in Bahrain. So the UAE is kind of playing all sides of this while serving as an oasis. The one thing to watch is there has been rumblings of dissent. No street protests like we've seen in other parts of the region, but online activists who've called for free elections of parliament. There have been 5 arrests of those activists. Clearly, the monarchy and the UAE government does not want to see any dissent arise, and I think they'll do everything possible to tamp things down.
I guess, is there enough of a broad-based group of people who feel either oppressed or you know, underprivileged, or however you want to characterize it? Is there a large enough sector there in the UAE to rise up to create problems for the monarchy?
Well, it's a very good and important question, Bob, because it highlights the fact that every one of these countries is different. You can't take the dynamics and the assumptions we've made for other countries like Libya or Bahrain or others and apply them across the region. UAE is very different. The population is very small, and frankly, as a proportion of the entire population, you have more foreign workers than native Emiratis. And for the most part, the Emiratis live very well. I think in some ways, though, that creates some potential tensions because, as one activist has said, the UAE has wanted to be #1 on all things, trade, investment, finance. Why can't we be #1 on democracy? And so in some ways, the fact that there's a privileged sense to the UAE, that there is advances in telecommunications and the economy, that may create expectations, but I haven't seen sort of a vast call from a middle class or the student class to change. That may change over time, but I don't see it. And certainly I think for a while, at least, the UAE will remain an oasis in the region.
And it could be that what's happening in Libya, the stalemate that we seem like we're headed for there, may give people some pause. I mean, this is not a happy ending yet.
Right, and the tumult and violence we're seeing in Syria as well, it may cause folks to rethink both tactics and timing in terms of raising concerns for reform.
All right. Interesting as always. Juan, thanks very much again.
Thank you, Bob.
And we'll see you next time on Flashpoints. Thanks for joining us.